at the new CPD scheme. Richard's going to tell us all the things that we need to know. Richard's a policy associate with the SRA in the education policy team. You've been there since 2012, and we've met previously while you've been doing some work with the Sole Practitioners Group on the new CPD scheme, didn't we, Richard?
Yeah, we certainly did.
And today you're going to help the delegate to think about all the things that they will need to think about when they're looking at changing. So this is the outline of the course for today. So we're going to look at why the SRA is implementing a new change, what the new regime is it better than what we've been doing for 20 or 30 years, and the fact that there aren't going to be any accredited trainers. In fact, that hasn't been the case for a couple of months. Practicing certificate renewals, whether or not people get the view that there's no CPD, what to do if you have taken a CPD a career break, and what to do for CPD. And we're going to be interspersing that with some survey results. Law CPD Solutions has undertaken a survey. Richard, you've seen the results of that survey. We had about 40 people respond to that, and we're going to be showing the delegates some of the survey results in response, so that it gives us a bit of focus as to what people think is happening and what they can do in the future. So Richard, the first question then is, why is the SRA implementing this change? What's wrong with the 16 hours approach?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, obviously, the current 16 hours approach has been with us now for 25 to 30 years. And I think actually it's worth recognising the positive role that approach has played in establishing a learning and development culture within the profession. 16 hours, people are aware of it, and they know they have to do some form of learning and development in order to meet it. But despite the 16 hours embedding itself and developing that culture, I think it's probably not fit for purpose today. And I think we at the SRA think there's a number of reasons why we've changed that approach. Firstly, 16 hours is an input measure to learning and development. There's no magic or science behind 16 hours. It's an arbitrary figure. There's nothing to say that if you do 15 hours, you're the world's worst solicitor, and if you do 18 hours, you're the world's best solicitor. It's purely based on an arbitrary number of hours.
Do you know where that came from? Because I think it was 85, was it 1985 that they introduced the 16 hours minimum? Do you know why they came to that figure, or was it just plucked out of thin air?
I'm not entirely sure why we arrived at the 16 hours. I mean, obviously 1985 was a very long time ago in terms of, I suppose, learning and development, and probably at the time an input measure was considered, I wouldn't say revolutionary, but considered certainly of its time.
Yeah.
I think, for the reason I said that, I think you just can't guarantee competence through 16 hours. We also felt that it was driving the wrong type of learning and development behaviour, and by that I mean some solicitors were more interested in undertaking learning and development to comply with our regulations as opposed to undertaking learning and development in order to maintain standards and be an effective solicitor. So there was a real kind of regulatory driver behind learning and development. In terms of the SRA's approach to regulation, we're moving away from blanket prescription, and the 16 hours approach, as it stood, applied to all solicitors, irrespective of their role, level of experience, and the type of work that they do. Now, it could be argued that not all solicitors need to do 16 hours in order to remain competent. Some might need to do more, and certainly some, depending on the type of work that they do, might need to do less. So we felt it was placing a kind of blanket regulation which possibly led to unnecessary regulatory costs for some solicitors and some firms.
So
that's the final point.
Yes, Richard,
Sorry.
sorry, I interrupted you. I was going to say that the cost that you're talking about is the cost to provide learning and development, so to go on a course or download a webinar or undertake the learning and development, it's an unnecessary burden for some firms, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. You know, if you had a particular solicitor who is doing quite transactional work, you know, possibly 16 hours for them is too much training. And if the way that they accumulate that training is going on courses, then actually that might not be the most cost-effective way of learning for them, which I think in itself is another driver behind change, in that learning and development, the way that information is produced and the way that which information is consumed has changed rapidly since the mid-80s. So actually there's a much broader church of ways in which people can engage with learning and development that suits a wider range of learning and development styles. So, you know, the traditional view of sitting in a course for 7 hours is again slightly outdated. So for all of those reasons, we thought that actually 16 hours is probably time to move away from that and think about a more fit for purpose approach to how we ensure that those that we regulate can deliver a proper standard of service.
So before we move on to the next slide, I would say that from practice, given that my main role is delivering CPD courses, usually in the classroom format, and even though I hear what you're saying, that it's slightly outmoded, lots of people just do like going out of the office for a day, sitting on a course with other people and learning things, and other people, probably like the delegates that are on the webinar today, you know, like receiving their training by webinars, and all of those are still going to be valid under the new scheme, and we're going to have a look at that. But there are always those people who will come on courses at this time of year, you know, probably the 30th of October, and they will take any course just to get the CPD points. And that's really what you're trying to stop people from doing, is to not just do anything, to do things that are going to help them in their careers instead of just meeting the hours requirements and ticking some boxes. That's right, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right, and I think, you know, certainly not saying that going to a course and sitting there is not, you know, a valid way of learning, because for some people it absolutely is. But you know, I think what we're saying is that actually there's a whole range of other ways in which people can kind of get learning development and take it on board. And your point around the kind of, I mean, we all hear the horror stories and we know of them, you know, kind of just, you know, will writers going on criminal advocacy courses. Those types of scenarios are, I suppose, driven by the regulatory kind of requirement to do 16 hours. They're not driven by someone thinking, actually, what is it I need to do in terms of learning and development in order to do my job effectively? And that's really at the crux of this.
Fantastic, thanks. Just to remind the delegates that there is a questions box that you can type questions to. Other people won't see that, and I'll ask Richard those questions as and when there's an appropriate break. So, Richard, if we're not doing 16 hours, what do you have to do? And we'll be talking about the timing of this in a moment, but so what's the new scheme, if you can outline it for us?
Okay, I mean, the new scheme is very much based on an existing regulatory obligation for a solicitor to deliver a proper standard of service. You know, that's Principle 5, irrespective of any CPD, continuing competence approach we have. You know, that's a core obligation on a solicitor. So we're really putting that at the heart of this new approach. So in terms of what practically we're asking people to do is in the first instance, is really for solicitors to regularly reflect on the quality of their practice, to identify learning and development needs, and then do something to address them. Now, appreciate for many solicitors and from many parts of the profession, you know, the word reflection is probably a little alien to them, but I think what it means in its simplest form is just taking some time away from your role, your function, to think about what it is you need to do in order to practice effectively. Now, there's lots of different questions you can ask yourself in terms of answering that question. For example, what are my strengths and weaknesses in relation to my job? How am I performing? What is it that I think I need to do in order to do my job more effectively? So that's what that's what we kind of mean about reflection, just taking some time out to think about what it is you need to do to practice effectively. I suppose the main question there, what do we mean by practice effectively? Well, obviously, as part of the launch of our new approach to continuing competence, we also issued a competence statement. Now, what that competence statement articulates are the sort of core skills, knowledge, and behaviours a solicitor should be able to do to practice effectively. So, through that competence statement, you've got a ready-made tool, a ready-made benchmark to use in order to help you think through what you need to do to practice effectively.
And just for the delegates, although I haven't included the competence statement as part of the handout, the competence statement is part of a toolkit of information and documentation on the SRA website. And so in order to help people to figure out how to do this and what the new regulations are, the SRA website has a specific section dedicated to the new approach, doesn't it, Richard?
It certainly does. I think we've got a slide on that a little bit later, so we can pick that up there. All of what I've probably just said, some people might be thinking, crikey, that sounds quite time-consuming. But we don't think it needs to be. Partly because most professionals tend to reflect quite regularly anyway. You might come out of a particular meeting, you might come out of a particular case, you might have provided some particular advice, and you may think, well, actually, I didn't do that as well as I could have done. Now, why didn't I do that as well as I should have done it? And by going through that process, you've identified a learning and development need. So you can do it in a very informal way. You can do it, on the bus, riding a bike, at the gym, when you're thinking through some of the things that have gone on, or there's opportunities to do it in a more structured way, and by that we mean most research we've undertaken suggests that a large majority of firms have performance management systems in place. People have appraisals at the beginning of the year, they might have one mid-year, but they certainly have one at the end. And that then also provides an opportunity to think, okay, what is it I need to do my job effectively? And there'll be other inputs into that process. You might have a line manager, a supervisor, you might be reviewing case management files, there'll be other types of information, client feedback will help you think through and articulate what learning and development needs are. So I suppose that deals with how you kind of get to a point where you've got a list of things that your learning and development needs you may need to address. We then expect you just to record that. We're not prescribing a particular way, we're simply saying you would need to record that, and I'll come on to why we're asking you to do that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Secondly, the second part of that is really then thinking through how then do you go about addressing that learning and development need. You might want to think about which of those learning development needs are more of a priority than others, and think through about the when, the how, the who of addressing those needs. Once you've done it, gone away and done it through a whole wide range of learning and development activities, you need to record what you've done, but more importantly, you need to evaluate whether or not that learning and development has met that original need. I think that's a critical part of our new process, because actually it might well identify other learning and development needs.
So what's interesting is that this new process is actually quite organic in that, for example, if you had a case that involved a new element or a new rule or a new regulation, you might have to immediately go away and look up the new rule. But if you had a case and it was something that you hadn't done for a while, you might be able to get through it. And at the end of that case, you would say, well, okay, I got through that, but it was a bit hairy. What could I do so that if this came up again, I'd be better prepared? so you've identified your learning need. You then have to go off and say, well, how am I going to fulfill that? I'll book a course, or I'll read a book, or I'll have a look at something, or maybe even go and speak to somebody else in the department and see if they've done it, and what advice they've got to get through this particular aspect, and then record that you've done that somewhere and say, well, does that meet the need? Am I going to be better prepared next time to deal with this particular issue? So it doesn't need to be something that you do once during the year at the appraisal, for example, does it? It's something that will be an ongoing review as you're going through your work and identifying gaps in your knowledge, or as new rules or regulations come about, you just need to keep up to date with them. So
absolutely. I mean, the legal services market is changing rapidly. There's new technology, new processes, new law, new case law. Take cybercrime, always evolving. So I think what we expect is that people will regularly review and kind of think about what it is that they need to do on a regular basis in order to meet that regulatory responsibility that I started off with around delivering the proper standard of service.
but it's also just common sense. It's common sense. If you're working as a solicitor every day, as I am, you do come across things and think, oh well, I don't know how to do this. I'm going to have to go off and find out how to do it. Or if it's outside my remit, I'll have to refer it on somewhere else. But you just need to know what your boundaries are, don't you?
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. And I think that's where sort of the competence statement and kind of legal knowledge comes in. We don't expect solicitors to know absolutely everything about everything, but for the role that you're performing, you should be able to have the knowledge, expertise, skills, behaviours to do it effectively. And it may well be that certain firms have their own standards that you can use as well. So it's just really thinking about what is it I need to do my job as well as I can.
What we did at Law CPD Solutions is that we did this survey, and just so that people can see some of the results of that survey, we asked people what types of CPD they like to do, and you can see quite high on that list. In fact, the most liked type of CPD activity is going to an external course or seminar, but there are lots of different types there. So in-house courses, webinars, other web-based learning. Lots of people read articles. Lots of solicitors will pick up the Gazette every week and read something in there which could advance your learning and development. Mentoring and coaching are really important, and legal research. So different types under the old system, which would be relevant CPD, and also under the new system. That's right, isn't it, Richard?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest change with our new approach is that there is a much greater degree of freedom and flexibility for an individual to determine what learning and development activity they undertake to address their needs. I think the key message from our perspective is that anything goes, but in doing so, you need to be able to demonstrate and justify how undertaking that activity relates to your role.
Yeah, so it's the evaluating that you had a need and this is how you decided to meet it, not just I had 3 hours CPD I needed to get, so I went on the closest available course.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Otherwise, our new approach is just, I suppose, reiterating the problems with the 16 hours approach. We want people to think, what is it that they need to do, and then they can choose from a whole range of a whole kind of very wide menu of and you've mentioned some on the previous slide around the types of things that they can do, and then certainly that's a massive benefit of the new approach. You're not boxed into doing a certain type of learning. We're not prescribing what learning people should do. Individuals know themselves best. They know their jobs better than we do as a regulator. So it's entirely rational for them to say, actually, I've got this need. I like learning in this way. If I undertake a particular type of learning, it's going to help me do my job better. That's, in essence, kind of part of what our new approach is. So I suppose that's an individual benefit to some extent. I suppose for firms themselves, there's probably 2 benefits that we've certainly heard and has come through quite strongly in all of the work that I've done speaking to firms, and that's at an organisation level. You can tailor learning and development plans across an organisation based on role or function. So you might have a particular group of people doing a particular type of function. You can think about how you address that holistically. And secondly, and I mentioned at the very beginning, in some cases there may well be a cost reduction. In particular, not everyone needs to do 16 hours, so there may well be less of a need for certain roles, for certain jobs, for certain functions to do 16 hours. They might have to do 4 hours or go on one particular course for lots of different reasons. So there's potentially cost saving there. I mean, the other one that has come up as well is that actually for firms, it's a real opportunity, and I suppose actually this does apply to individuals as well. It's a really good opportunity to be innovative, to put on training that is engaging, that is different, that deals with really kind of important issues from that firm or individual's perspective. It can be really tailored to meet key questions. So, certainly the feedback we've received is that actually, change is never easy. Change is difficult, but people can see that there are real benefits at an individual solicitor level as well as the firm level.
It's worth mentioning here, isn't it, that where you're talking about different training needs for different people. So, for example, I was doing a course, I was giving a course this week, and somebody said to me, "Oh, well, this is probably the last time I'll see you because I'm retiring in 18 months or so." And that person was saying that, they've always enjoyed coming along to courses, but as their career has progressed, they have not needed to come on as many courses, because even though the 16 hours is mandatory, when you've been doing something for a long time, your need for CPD might reduce depending on the type of law that you practice. Whereas within a firm, if you've got some newly qualified practitioners, I always find that they're the ones that are embracing all types of learning and development and would like to do more, whereas firms who have a tight training budget might be saying, well, everybody needs to do 16 hours, so that's where the budget's going. Whereas now they can say, well, our partners or people who are 20 years post-qualified in this field of law are saying they only need kind of 3 hours formal learning, and so we can redirect the budget to those people who are saying that they would like more learning and development. So that's the benefit, and within that there could be a cost saving.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you've just said there is what certainly we're hearing in terms of how people are going to approach it. Not everybody is the same. People at different points in their career, they have different experiences, skills, knowledge, and what this enables people, what this enables individuals to do is to think about how they address it at that particular point in their career. Someone who is a partner will have completely different needs, learning development needs, to someone who, as you said, is just recently qualified. So, there is an element of flexibility, tailoring involved with this new approach.
So the thing that I've heard some people worrying about, and on social media I've seen a few people mention this recently, is the fact that there are no more accredited trainers. So what's happened to that accreditation, Richard?
You're absolutely right. From the 1st of November 2014, we removed the requirement to undertake accredited training. Now, the reason why we did that was accredited training is a prescriptive measure, and obviously if we're moving towards enabling people to take advantage of the freedom and flexibility that I've talked about, then having prescription there isn't particularly helpful. I suppose the other angle to it is really, and this is from us as a regulator, what did having the SRA's accredited training kite mark, for want of a better word, what did it really mean? And obviously we accredited training, but I suppose from our perspective it was really difficult to ensure that every bit of learning and development every bit of training provided, every piece of material provided by an accredited trainer was of a sufficient quality. We just couldn't guarantee quality. That's not to say that there was poor quality, but in some circumstances, you know, that there may well have been. We could have done it, but at great expense and a real different type of regulation. So, you know, there are two clear drivers why we actually thought, you know, it's time for us to move back from accrediting training and actually let the market itself determine what is quality. You know, it's no place for regulation. It's up to the market and people in the market to determine what's good training. Like, you go on bad training, you know, you don't go again. You know, you speak to people about training, you say, well, actually, that was a rubbish course, that was a really good course. You know, accreditation and kind of quality control can be sort of controlled by the market forces themselves, really. So I think that's why we moved away from accredited training. You know, it's not to say that the types of learning and development that those accredited training provided isn't still relevant, because absolutely it will be. And it will be, you know, necessary for people with different types of learning styles, etc. So I think all we're saying is that actually, you know, the kite mark wasn't, you know, 100% guarantee of competence, and actually we want people to have the freedom and flexibility. Therefore, we need to remove a requirement to undertake accredited training.
So one of the things that's my personal bugbear as a result of this is that a lot of people aren't aware that this has been removed, and I see quite often on leaflets advertising training courses that they are accredited, but of course no one is accredited, not with the SRA. So they might be accredited with the Bar Council or the Bar Standards Board, but they're not accredited with the SRA because you just don't do accreditation anymore.
Yeah, that's right, and I think it's unfortunately that's a slight byproduct of any change in policy where there is a transitional period. You know, certainly from 1st of November, well, certainly from 1st of November 2014, trainers and providers shouldn't be holding themselves out as accredited training, but inevitably that will still happen. We're speaking to providers to sort of explain the situation to them. And certainly from when the new scheme is mandatory for all solicitors, from the 1st of November 2016, then you know, that will naturally fall off from that point.
So what's going to happen with the practicing certificate renewals? Because I mean, this is something which at the Culp and Coffer conference a couple of weeks ago, I think Julie Brannan covered, and certainly was covered by the legal press. So if you can take us through the practicing certificate renewal and what a lot of people have been talking about as the missing year, that would be really helpful, I think.
Okay, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is one of, if not the biggest question we get asked, is, you know, what am I declaring against, and how do I make that declaration? Probably taking a step back, the reason why we have a declaration is driven by the fact we actually take it really seriously now. It's not to say that we didn't take the 16 hours seriously, but, you know, our focus as a regulator is on competence, is on standards, so requiring all solicitors to make a declaration that they have reflected on their practice and addressed any identified learning development needs is absolutely critical to us as a regulator. As you've got on the slide there, the process by which that declaration will be made will continue to be through the PCRE process. So you can fill it in as an individual, or it will be completed as part of a bulk application. And I think it's important to recognise the wording of that declaration as well, in the sense that we're not asking you to say whether you're competent or not, and that's something that I think people get confused with, is that, you know, for example, at the Culp and Coffer conference, you mentioned a lot of Culp and Coffers, particularly the Culp, were concerned that they'd have to be making an assessment of each and every single solicitor that their firm employs competent. We're not asking to do that. What we're simply saying is, have you done what we've asked you to do in terms of reflecting on practice and addressing identified learning and development needs? Because if you have, it's likely that you will be competent I think that's quite an important point.
Yeah.
In terms of technicalities, at the moment, from the 1st of April, the scheme is voluntary, so it's up to you whether you adopt it or not, or whether you continue to remain with the 16 hours approach. As I mentioned before, the scheme becomes mandatory for all solicitors from the 1st of November 2016. So what happens in terms of the annual declaration and the type of declaration you make is really dependent upon when you decide to opt into the new approach. So for the forthcoming PCR, which kind of ends today, all solicitors will be making their 16 hours declaration, and that's because the declaration is being made against the previous 12-month CPD year. So for the next PCRE exercise, you'll either be making a declaration against the new approach and against the wording which was on the previous slide, or you'll be making the declaration against the 16 hours approach. And then going forward, for the 2017 PCRE, every solicitor will be making a declaration against the new approach because, as I said, from the 1st of November, it becomes mandatory. Now, you mentioned the missing year, and that is really important. We won't be asking, as part of the 2017 PCRE, for a declaration against the 2014-15 year. And the reason for that being is that everyone would have moved to the new approach then. We'll be asking for people to make the declaration that is relevant to the year that they undertook the work. Having a declaration that's historical, as this new approach isn't mandatory for everyone, doesn't add any value to anything really. It just tells us what you did or didn't do over 12 months ago. So that's the reason why there is a missing year. We're comfortable with that. What it does mean is that actually this isn't a message from the SRA saying that for a particular year you can't and you don't have to undertake any learning and development. That's absolutely not the message we're giving. What we're saying is learning and development is still important, in every year right up until mandatory implementation, but you just don't have to tell us that you've done it. And again, going back to the regulatory requirement, you have a regulatory requirement, and firms have a regulatory requirement, I should point out, to do this. So, it's just really a kind of a process point rather than a principle point that you won't tick the box for a particular year, but actually you should still be doing the learning and development.
So by way of an example, Richard, I have until the end of today to complete my practicing certificate renewal, which I haven't got around to doing this month. And I will be declaring the 16 hours declaration for which year does that relate to? It doesn't relate to the last 12 months, it relates to 13, 14, doesn't it?
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's a kind of quite a bizarre arrangement that we've maintained since we adopted this and took over the requirement to regulate CPD from the Law Society.
Because I'd never noticed that. I'd never noticed it until I read the articles about the missing year, that I was always declaring for the previous year. I'd never noticed that it was kind of in arrears, so to speak. And what you're doing in the transitional phases is you're bringing it right up to date now, aren't you?
Absolutely. And I think, you couldn't put it better. It's just another reason for removing the requirement to make a declaration in arrears. We're bringing it right up until the present. You're making a declaration within the year that you've undertaken the learning rather than almost beyond 12 months ago.
And then a year from now, when on the 30th of October I do my practicing certificate renewal, because I always seem to wait until the last day to do it, I will then be declaring as against the new the new declaration, which is on that slide, because I decided to go over to the new scheme when it was opened on the 1st of April of this year. So I'll be declaring that I've reflected on my practice, and that's the declaration that I'll be making. And then going forward in all the renewals, that's the declaration I will make. But next year, some people will either be declaring against 16 hours if they stayed in the old scheme, or if they moved over to the new scheme like me, they'll be making the new declaration.
Absolutely, and I said, if you've moved over before kind of the end of this particular year, then you'll be making a new declaration. If you moved over after, you'll still be making the 16 hours. So I think that's the distinction.
Yeah, so that's before tomorrow. If you decide before tomorrow, and you don't need to tell anyone about it, that you're doing that, hopefully you would have given it a bit more thought, because you would be making that very serious declaration that you had reflected on your practice and identified needs. But because I've known about the change for quite some time, it's a decision that I made back in April. So I've definitely addressed all my learning and development needs for this year. And I calculated this morning, Richard, that this month I've given 62 hours worth of CPD presentations alone.
That's very impressive, isn't it? That's quite a large number.
Phenomenal, yeah. So the knowledge statement, I mentioned this earlier, and for delegates who would like to download this rather than find it on the SRA website, there is a drop-down list that's called handouts, and there are 2 handouts there that people can just access and download while they're taking the webinar. One of the handouts is this presentation that they can download and keep. Of course, this presentation is being recorded and we put it on our website, so if people want to see it again, then it's going to be there. But the statement of legal knowledge from the SRA website is also there, so that people can have a look at it whilst we're talking. But can you just let us know what the knowledge statement is, because it may be that some delegates haven't heard of it before.
Yeah, the knowledge statement is part of, I suppose, what I mentioned before in terms of the competence statement, and it defines the legal knowledge and in relation to particular levels that we would expect a solicitor to be able to have and be able to demonstrate. In relation to the new approach, we get asked quite regularly whether or not a solicitor needs to know absolutely everything that we've put in that knowledge statement.
Because it's really wide-ranging, isn't it? It doesn't just cover your area; it covers everything.
Absolutely, it covers the whole breadth of practice, different types of law, and the simple answer is no. You don't need to know and make yourself up to date with every single aspect of legal knowledge. It's about what's relevant to your role and to your job and to what you need to know in order to stay up to date. The other element to it actually is, we would expect individuals to know where to pass off a particular issue as well. So having some understanding of kind of where the remit of knowledge lies, and understanding, well, actually, I totally don't get this. This isn't for me, and being able to spot an issue that then requires bringing in another a colleague or passing a bit of work on. So I think that in terms of the knowledge statement, they're the two key points really. You don't have to know it all. You just need to stay up to date and remain up to date with the knowledge required to do your job, and be aware of where you need to pass something on.
And a lot of this is common sense. So, for example, the example that we've got on the slide there, if you're a criminal solicitor and someone asks you to draft a will, and you haven't drafted a will since you were at the College of Law, for example, then you know that you should probably pass that piece of work on to somebody who does know how to draft a will. It's something that's obvious to solicitors in practice, that you don't dabble in areas of law that you don't have the competence to deal with.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's why we're doing, and we're making these types of statements and applying the knowledge statement in that particular way, because people are on the whole fairly sensible and won't get involved in work that they don't have the knowledge, the skills to do.
Okay, so then what if people, and I hear this quite often, what if I don't do any CPD? What are you going to do about it at the SRA?
It is a very good question. I think, again, this is where one of the biggest changes is behind this new approach. In terms of the 16 hours and in terms of the task, everyone has to make a tick a box. 16 hours is commonly referred to as a tick box exercise.
Yeah.
We've got some responsibility in that, in the sense that we haven't proactively used that information and data we get through that exercise as effectively and efficiently as we can. So in terms of, if someone doesn't do any CPD, and they tell us that they haven't, which I suppose is a question there whether they would or not, but if someone declares for whatever reason that they haven't done any CPD, we'll know about that. We'll use that information. We'll look at that information against lots of other different types of regulatory information that comes into the SRA on a daily basis, and we'll come to a judgment and we'll think, well, actually, is there a risk of is there a competence risk here? A tangible example might be that someone doesn't make a declaration, and over the last 6 months we've received information, let's say from the legal ombudsman, about a particular firm or a particular individual within the firm whose drafting and contract drafting has been very poor, that's led to subsequent issues. Now, we can put the two bits of information together and say, actually, we think we might need to go and have a chat to this individual. We might have to engage with this particular firm. So we'll be using the information to the annual declaration proactively and as part of our kind of targeted, proportionate approach to regulation. I suppose as well, there's a non-regulatory issue here as well. But if you're not doing your learning and development, then your firm is likely to kind of have a view on that as well. The market is particularly competitive. What differentiates firms is often kind of the service they provide, the quality of the advice. It's not just all about price.
Yeah.
So people should be doing learning and development. So I think there's a kind of regulatory option behind it. I suppose the other aspect to it really is as well, I've talked about reflection, and theoretically an individual solicitor might well reflect, and they might come to the conclusion that actually I don't need to do any learning and development, I think, based on my self-assessment, but based on speaking to kind of my supervisor, line manager, taking into account client feedback. There isn't much for me to do here. Then technically, under the new approach, they can say, well, actually, I haven't had to do any learning development. That's absolutely fine. How practical that is in reality is probably a different story, because, as you talked about, things change really quickly.
Yeah.
Law changes. So the point being is that, I suppose if you arrive at a situation where you think, I don't need to do any learning and development, you'll need to be able to demonstrate to us that you have reflected and you've gone through a process to arrive at that particular conclusion.
See, what I hear quite often, Richard, is what I've put on this slide, which is lots of people have said they don't need to do any CPD anymore. And it absolutely infuriates me, because if you or I went to a doctor and the doctor said to us, oh, yeah, no, I qualified 10 years ago and I don't have to do any CPD or learning and development. So all I know today is what I learned 10 years ago and things that I've picked up along the way. You would be a little bit shocked, wouldn't you, if you went to any other professional and they said, no, I've just decided that what I learned in my degree was enough for me. I don't need to do anything other than that. So it seems quite often to me insane that people think that that's what these new changes mean, that you don't have to do CPD. As you explained, there are some circumstances in which some people may not need to do CPD, but as long as you've reflected on what you need to do and where the gaps are in your information, and then you come to that conclusion, that's fine. But it is not the starting point, is it?
Absolutely. I think the example you've given there with the doctors is a really good one. As a regulator, one of our regulatory objectives is to protect the consumer, consumers of legal services. I'd flip it back round and say, in some ways the easiest option is the 16 hours, because people just went off and did, attended courses that were not relevant to their role or to the job. This is harder.
Yeah.
It's much more robust. You have to think about how you as a solicitor, how you as a professional meet your regulatory objectives, delivering proper standard of service. You know, that can be hard. It can, you know, it's probably an uncommon skill at this particular stage for some solicitors to be probably critical of their performance, but you know, we need to do it, you know, and from a regulatory perspective, and also, you know, what people forget, you know, in terms of is this an easy option? Well, it's actually, it's really bad business if you don't. If you just carry on doing nothing, then that is likely to affect how you or your firm goes about its business, and there's a real business driver
Yeah.
behind staying up to date, being competent, and being good at your job, irrespective of any regulation. So it's not an easy option. And in terms of the kind of how we use the information we get from the scheme, you know, it's not deregulation, which is the other thing we hear.
Yeah.
We're on top of it, and we're going to monitor this, and we're paying a lot more attention to the competence of solicitors.
So then how do practitioners know if what they are doing is CPD or learning and development? So if they say, well, I did 10 minutes reading an article, does that count? What are the parameters?
It's a difficult question to answer, because I suppose in theory the only parameter is that a solicitor will need to be able to, I suppose, reasonably justify any learning and development that they've undertaken and how it relates to their role. You know, we want to give people freedom and flexibility. You know, the reason why we're doing that is because there's different types of learning styles. The learning and development market has changed. There's a lot more out there. You know, we've talked about kind of podcasts, reading online blogs, watching short videos, listening to interviews, you know, reading, you know, kind of more traditional kind of articles, research. You know, anything really is within reason is valid, as long as there's a kind of tangible link back to the need itself. I mean, I suppose what we're trying to avoid is that, go back to our example of the criminal advocate undertaking will writing training. Now, from our perspective, they wouldn't be able to demonstrate that the will writing has a particular relevance to their role. So we would expect, you know, people to be able to do that, but the way in which they go about undertaking the learning development, or the vehicles that they use, or how they do it, is, you know, that's where the freedom and flexibility now lies.
So the next slide is from our survey, and we asked people if they had done different types of CPD, which I know are fairly important, and although you're not prescriptive at the SRA about CPD that people should do, these are the types of areas that across all different types of law you would expect solicitors to have had a hand in somewhere. And you can see that the sort of light blue purpley colour at the bottom shows when people have never done training in those areas, and that's really quite surprising, isn't it, Richard, particularly with reference to the first one, which is ethics. That's quite a number of people who have never done any ethics training, because the SRA have got a particular interest in ethics at the moment, haven't they?
Yeah, I think it is really surprising. Yeah, absolutely, ethics, accounts, money laundering. I mean, some of those, in effect, are actually covered by wider legislation than just the SRA. You know,
Yeah.
take money laundering, for example. So it is surprising. But you're right. As a focus, we you know, ethics, being an ethical solicitor. You know, I'm sure many of the delegates who have joined today have probably seen our Question of Trust campaign, which is, you know, starts to question and place ethics at the very heart of what we do as a regulator. And so, yeah, I mean, I am quite surprised that,
And this is
you know,
just
that not many people do.
Yeah, and it's just to highlight to people, and this is the small, it's a small survey sample of, I think, 40 people responded to our survey, that actually it's more than just learning about your area of law, because lots of people will say to me, well, you know, I've been doing this for 30 years. I think I know what I'm doing. It's about keeping up to date with your area of law, but it's also about keeping up to date with these things. And I think that the regulatory environment is quite important because like myself, a lot of people qualified as lawyers under the old code of conduct and the old rules of regulation. And actually, we're now in the outcomes focused regulation regime, so to speak. And many people only look at the handbook if something goes wrong or they need an answer to something. But actually, that's not the way that regulation works these days, does it? There's no answer in the handbook. The handbook gives you some indicative behaviours and it sets out behaviours that would be expected. But actually, a lot of it is up to the individual or the practice to sort out themselves.
Yeah, and I suppose I suppose looking at these figures and I suppose not knowing who's answered them, you know, I suppose the counter argument to that to some extent is that, you know, with the implementation of a culp and coffer,
Yeah.
it may well be that some of that is picked up and kind of disseminated to firms through that particular. I mean, they are quite interesting. Makes it interesting reading for us. I think we'd certainly like to kind of take those away and have a think through about what it may mean for us kind of going forward.
So then, what for those people who've taken a bit of a career break for whatever reason, or they go and practice overseas, or they're over here and they've taken a couple of years out, what do they need to do with reference to their CPD and practicing certificate renewals?
I think the best way of framing this is in terms of the new approach, because I think it highlights where there is a difference. From the 1st of November, what we'll be saying is that actually all solicitors that hold a PC and who we regulate will need to kind of reflect on the quality of their practice, irrespective of where they practice. So that's a change. And then I think in terms of if you're taking a career break, we can't expect you to undertake learning development, because it might well be that you're on quite a significant career break, you know, or maternity leave, for example. But I think what we would expect is that when you come back to practice, one of the first things you would do is sit down and go, okay, you know, I've been away for a while now. I want to understand how the landscape has changed. You know, have there been any changes in law, technology? What's changed within my firm? Any processes different? You know, and that will then drive learning and development needs. So, you know, the minute you kind of start practicing again, that's the point where you should be reflecting and going through these stages that I talked about earlier.
And so many training providers have return to practice courses in different areas of law. So if you're returning to family law, for example, I run a family law return to practice course, which just brings you up to date with all the changes in the last couple of years. And it would be pretty much what you needed to return to practice as a family lawyer. From a family law perspective, there would be other things that we looked at in the last slide that you may also want to take into account. But it's just about being sensible and saying, what could I have missed before you start dealing with clients?
Absolutely. It's about thinking just what is it I need to do to deliver a proper standard of service? You know, what am I not up to speed on?
Yeah. So this last slide, talk us through the toolkit. I can see your picture right on the bottom left there, Richard. One of the videos that you've done. I managed to cut myself out because I'm on one of these toolkit videos as well.
At least people can see what I now look like. I look less pain at the moment than I did at that particular point. The toolkit is really in response to the fact that we recognise that this is a cultural change for the profession. You know, we've been with 16 hours for 25, 30 years. People are used to it. They've built systems, processes, ways of working around it. And now that's changing. So, you know, as a regulator, as a responsible regulator, we felt it was absolutely proper and absolutely appropriate that we put information out to help people with that change. So what the toolkit does really is break down some of the stages that I've talked about: reflection, planning, addressing needs, recording, evaluating, and gives handy hints, helpful information on what people might want to think through, what they might want to be aware of, what they might want to take into account. There are some kind of helpful forms up there around a development plan, a development record. It's really there as a tool, as guidance. It's not regulation, and it's not guidance in terms of regulatory guidance. It's just really helpful information that can help people manage the journey from moving from the 16 hours to this new approach. I mean, there's lots of videos from practitioners on there about how they do the things that they need to do under our new approach. There's research, there's under the sharing resources bit, there's how other organisations and firms have gone about doing this. And this will grow. It's an organic piece of work that as more and more people adopt the new approach, we want people to contribute to it. So we'll be regularly updated with more information, more webinars, etc. So if there's a reference tool, it's not mandatory, it's not exhaustive, it's there for people to use it in the way that they think will give them benefit and help them manage the change.
So just before we finish for today, I'm going to launch our poll, Richard. So I've opened a poll that people should be able to see on their screens, which is about moving over to the new CPD scheme. And if people can take part in that poll, if they can see that, that would be really helpful. And so what we're asking is, has your firm moved over to the new CPD scheme? And if you can vote now, that would be great. And we can see who has moved over to the new scheme. In fact, a lot of people that I've spoken to have thought about it and they haven't quite decided to move over. So it'll be interesting to see what people say. So I'll give you another couple of seconds to vote on that poll, and then I'm going to close the poll. And it looks to me as though it's kind of mixed, Richard. 20% of people have said yes, their firm has moved over. 40% have said no, but they plan to move over before the 1st of November, which is tomorrow. So after next week, they'll be over to the new scheme. And 20% said they're going to wait until the mandatory deadline, and 20% say they don't know what the firms are doing. And that's something that you recommend, is that people speak to their firms and find out what's going on, isn't it, Richard? That even though individuals can make that decision, that they really speak to their firms and see what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think in reality and in practice, this is likely to be a firm-led decision in consultation with their employees, because of the system changes and changes to, say, performance management systems that need to be accompanied the implementation of this new approach. But it's really good to see. I think we're quite reassuring in a way for us to see and to hear the results of that poll, because I think that's very much in line with our thinking. It's in line with how the information we've received, that actually, about 25% of everyone we speak to has already moved. A bigger chunk will move from the start of the new CPD year.
That's right, yeah.
The next chunk will go at the last point, and that's absolutely fine. You don't need to tell us. It's entirely a firm solicitor decision. And there will be lots of different pools and constraints on when people move. So I think it's good that people can see the advantages already and starting to recognise them, and they're going to take advantage of them.
Yeah, so I mean that means that 60% of the people that have voted in our poll are saying that by Monday they will have moved over to the new scheme, which is great, really. So it's people embracing change, which is always good to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's reassuring to know that our messages are out there and things people have taken on board what the scheme's about. I mean, for those that perhaps haven't thought about it yet, the toolkit is there. You can dip into it. It's really quite accessible to interact with. I mean, if you just watch the videos on the toolkit, you get a really good sense of what's involved with the new approach. So people can access it and certainly go to it to help inform your thinking.
Thank you very much for your time today, Richard. I've put your photograph and your details on the slide there. Richard, as I said, is a policy associate with the SRA's Regulation and Education team. Those are my details at the end there. If you need to get in touch with me about anything to do with today's webinar, then please do send me an email. After the webinar finishes, there's a very short survey, 3 questions. If you can fill that in, that would be really wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us today, Richard.
Thank you very much for allowing me to come and talk about it as well, and hopefully people are a bit more clearer on why we're doing and what's involved with the new approach.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye.